Killed them all, of course. 5 words, whispered to no one, in an empty bathroom, by a man who thought the microphone clipped to his jacket was turned off. It was not turned off. Miles Ghost Hunter here, and this is the story of Robert Durst. Heir to a New York real estate empire worth billions, a man who spent 4 decades walking away from the bodies he left behind. 3 people connected to him are gone: his wife, his best friend, his neighbor. 3 decades of silence, 3 decades of money buying the best lawyers, the best alibis, the best version of every story. And then a documentary crew from HBO handed him a microphone, and he walked into a bathroom, and he talked to himself, and the tape kept rolling. But before we get to that bathroom, before we hear those 5 words in context, we need to go back, way back, to a January night in 1982, to a woman named Kathleen, to the night she vanished from the face of the earth and never came back. Because that is where all of this begins. Kathleen McCormack was 29 years old. She was in her 4th year at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx. She wanted to become a pediatrician. She had grown up in a working-class family on Long Island, one of 5 children, and she had clawed her way into medical school through scholarships and determination. Her classmates described her as brilliant, focused, someone who studied late into the night and still showed up early the next morning with coffee for the group. She was also married to one of the wealthiest men in New York, Robert Durst, son of Seymour Durst. The Durst family owned skyscrapers, entire blocks of Manhattan. Their real estate empire was worth an estimated $4 billion. Robert was the eldest son, the heir apparent, the one who was supposed to take the throne. Kathleen met Robert in the early 1970s. Friends described her as enchanted by him at first. He was quiet, intense, a little strange, but generous. He paid for things without thinking. Dinners, trips, gifts. The kind of wealth that seems romantic before you realize it comes with strings attached to every dollar. They married in 1973. For the first few years, things seemed fine. Kathleen enrolled in medical school. Robert worked for his father's company. They had a home in South Salem, a quiet town in Westchester County, about an hour north of Manhattan. A nice life, a normal life, at least from the outside. But by the late 70s, the cracks were showing. Friends of Kathleen began noticing things. She started showing up with bruises. She told one friend that Robert had pulled her by the hair. She told another that he had pushed her down the stairs. She confided in her medical school advisor that she was afraid of her husband, afraid of what he might do if she tried to leave. And by January of 1982, Kathleen had decided to leave. She wanted a divorce. She wanted her share of the Durst fortune, and she had told Robert. She had told him directly. Friends confirmed it. Kathleen had said the words, "I want out." January 31st, 1982. A Sunday night. It had been snowing. Kathleen and Robert attended a dinner party at the home of friends in South Salem. Witnesses said the evening was tense. The two of them barely spoke to each other. At approximately 9:30, they left the party and drove back to their cottage. That was the last time anyone outside that cottage saw Kathleen McCormack Durst alive. According to Robert, he and Kathleen argued that night. He said she decided to take the train back to their apartment in Manhattan. He said he drove her to the train station in Katona. He said she got on the 9:17 train. He said he went home and went to sleep. The next morning, January 31st turned into February 1st. Kathleen did not show up at medical school. She did not call anyone. She did not appear at the apartment in Manhattan. She did not contact her family. Robert Durst did not report his wife missing. It was not Robert who called the police. It was Kathleen's friends. It was her family. Days went by before anyone officially filed a missing persons report. And when detectives finally arrived to speak with Robert Durst, they found a man who was calm, composed, and utterly unshaken by the disappearance of his wife. He told them the train story again. She got on the 917. That was the last I saw of her. The police checked the 917 train from Katona to Manhattan. They checked the conductors, the schedules, the stations. Nobody remembered seeing Kathleen Durst on any train that night. No ticket, no witness, no evidence that she ever made it to that platform. But in 1982, the investigation stalled. The Durst family was powerful. Robert had lawyers before detectives finished their first round of questions, and there was no body. Without a body, without physical evidence, without a confession, the case went cold. Not frozen cold. There is a difference. Frozen means preserved. Cold means abandoned. For the next 18 years, Kathleen McCormack Durst existed in a bureaucratic purgatory. Not dead, not alive, just missing. A file in a cabinet, a name on a list that nobody was reading. Her family never stopped looking. Her brothers, her sisters, her mother. They wrote letters, they called detectives, they begged newspapers to run stories, and nothing happened. 18 years of nothing. Then something changed. In the year 2000, a new district attorney in Westchester County reopened the case of Kathleen McCormack Durst. New eyes, new technology, new willingness to look at what the original investigators had missed or avoided. And the first thing the new team did was compile a list of witnesses they needed to interview. At the top of that list was a name: Susan Berman. Susan Berman was Robert Durst's closest friend. They had known each other since college at UCLA in the late 1960s. Susan was the daughter of David Berman, a prominent figure in the Las Vegas organized crime world. She grew up surrounded by money and secrecy. She understood both. Susan and Robert shared a bond that friends described as almost familial. She was fiercely loyal to him. She had been his confidant for decades. And in 1982, when Kathleen vanished, Susan Berman had been one of the people providing Robert's alibi. She told investigators that Robert had called her that night, that his story checked out, that there was nothing suspicious. Now, 18 years later, the Westchester prosecutors wanted to talk to Susan again. They wanted to go over her story. They wanted details. They wanted to see if her account still held up under fresh scrutiny. Susan Berman never made it to that interview. On December 24, 2000, Christmas Eve, Susan Berman was found in her home in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles. She had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. No sign of forced entry, no robbery, nothing taken from the house except Susan Berman's life. She was 55 years old. The timing was not subtle. The Westchester investigators had scheduled their interview with Susan for early January 2001. She was found dead on December 24th. Someone knew the interview was coming. Someone decided that Susan Berman could not be allowed to sit in that room and answer those questions. Los Angeles police investigated. They looked at Susan's life, her finances, her relationships. She had been struggling with money. Her writing career had stalled. She owed back taxes. But none of her financial troubles pointed to anyone who would execute her in her own home. What pointed somewhere was the connection to Robert Durst, and the timing of her death relative to the reopened Kathleen Durst case. But pointing is not proving. The LAPD could. He ran. Not to another country, not to a tropical island with no extradition. Robert Durst, heir to a $4 billion real estate empire, ran to Galveston, Texas. A small Gulf Coast city known for shrimp boats and hurricanes, not for harboring Manhattan billionaires. And he did not go as Robert Durst. He rented a cheap apartment on Avenue K for $300 a month. He told the landlord his name was Dorothy Siner. He dressed as a woman, wig, glasses, frumpy clothes. A man worth billions, living in a roach-infested apartment, pretending to be a mute woman named Dorothy. Think about that for a moment. Why does a man with unlimited resources, with the ability to go anywhere in the world, choose to disguise himself as a woman in a rundown Texas apartment? What is he hiding from? Or rather, who is he hiding from? In that apartment building on Avenue K, Robert Durst had a neighbor, an elderly man named Morris Black, 71 years old, a loner, a drifter, someone who had bounced around the edges of society for most of his life. No family to speak of, no one who would come looking. Morris Black and the person he knew as Dorothy Siner became acquaintances. They shared a building, they crossed paths in hallways, and at some point, according to what investigators later pieced together, Morris Black began to suspect that his neighbor Dorothy was not who she claimed to be. He may have seen something, he may have heard something, he may have simply looked too closely. On September 28, 2001, a 13-year-old boy fishing in Galveston Bay hooked something that was not a fish. It was a garbage bag. Inside the garbage bag were body parts, a torso, limbs, carefully dismembered, wrapped in black plastic, weighted down but not weighted down enough. Over the next several days, more bags surfaced, more body parts. The medical examiner was able to identify the remains as Morris Black through fingerprint comparison. Every piece of Morris Black was eventually recovered from Galveston Bay, except one. His head was never found. Police traced Morris Black to the apartment building on Avenue K. They traced Dorothy Siner to the same building. And when they went looking for Dorothy Siner, they found that Dorothy Siner did not exist. The name was an alias. The person behind the wig and the glasses was Robert Durst. Robert Durst was arrested in Galveston on October 9, 2001, not at his apartment. He was picked up at a Wegmans supermarket in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, after being spotted shoplifting a chicken sandwich and a Band-Aid. A man with access to billions of dollars, arrested for stealing a sandwich worth $6. He was extradited back to Texas to face charges for the death of Morris Black. Now here is where the story takes a turn that will make you question everything you think you know about the American justice system. Robert Durst went to trial in Galveston in 2003, and his defense was unlike anything the courtroom had ever heard. He admitted to dismembering Morris Black. He admitted it openly. He described how he had used a bow saw and an axe to cut the body into pieces. He described how he had placed the pieces into garbage bags. He described how he had loaded the bags into his car and driven to Galveston Bay. He described how he had dropped the bags into the water. He admitted to all of it, but he said it was self-defense. His story was that Morris Black had come to his apartment with a gun, that they struggled, that the gun went off, that Morris Black was struck and died, that Robert Durst panicked, that he did not call the police because he was a fugitive, because he was wanted for questioning in the Susan Berman case, because he knew no one would believe a man living under a fake identity and a wig. And so, he said, he dismembered the body. Not because he was a predator, but because he was scared. The defense team Robert Durst hired was among the most expensive in Texas history. His lead attorney, Dick DeGuerin, was considered one of the best criminal defense lawyers in the state. The defense painted Robert Durst not as a cold-blooded predator, but as a frightened, mentally ill man who had made terrible decisions under impossible pressure. The prosecution had dismemberment. The prosecution had flight. The prosecution had fake identities. But the prosecution did not have one thing: the head of Morris Black. Without the head, the medical examiner could not definitively determine the cause of death, could not confirm or deny the self-defense claim with absolute certainty. On November 11, 2003, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty. Robert Durst walked out of a Texas courtroom a free man. He had admitted to cutting a human being into pieces and dumping those pieces in a bay, and 12 jurors said, not guilty. Let that sink in for a moment. A man confesses to dismembering a body and walks free. How does that happen? It happens when you can afford the best lawyers money can buy. It happens when the critical piece of evidence, the victim's head, is missing. It happens when the prosecution cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt how the victim died. And it happens in America, in a courtroom, with cameras rolling. Robert Durst was convicted of bail jumping and evidence tampering. He served time. But for the death of Morris Black, for the dismemberment, for the disposal of a human body in garbage bags, Robert Durst was acquitted. 3 people connected to Robert Durst were gone. Kathleen vanished in 1982. Susan, shot in 2000. Morris, dismembered in 2001. And Robert Durst had not been convicted for any of their deaths. That was the state of things for the next 7 years. 3 bodies, 0 convictions. The Durst family fortune continued to grow. Robert continued to live. And the families of Kathleen McCormack and Susan Berman and Morris Black continued to wait for something that looked like justice. Then, in 2010, a filmmaker named Andrew Jarecki entered the picture. Jarecki was not new to the Durst story. In 2010, he had directed a fictional film called __0__, starring Ryan Gosling as a character loosely based on Robert Durst. The film dramatized the disappearance of Kathleen, the death of Susan, the Galveston trial. It was a Hollywood version of events, but it was rooted in real facts. And something extraordinary happened. Robert Durst saw the film, and Robert Durst reached out to Andrew Jarecki. He wanted to talk. This is the moment that changed everything. Most people in Durst's position, people who have been accused of multiple homicides, people who have stood trial for dismemberment, most of those people do not voluntarily sit down with a filmmaker and agree to on-camera interviews. Their lawyers would never allow it. Their survival instincts would scream, no. But Robert Durst was not most people. He had spent his entire life believing he was the smartest person in every room. He had beaten the system in Galveston. He had outlasted the investigators in Westchester. He had survived the LAPD investigation into Susan Berman. 3 decades, 3 cases, 3 walks. He believed he could talk his way through anything. Andrew Jarecki began filming what would become The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, a 6-part documentary series for HBO. Over the course of several years, Jarecki conducted extensive interviews with Robert Durst, on camera, with microphones, with Durst's full consent. The interviews were extraordinary. Durst was calm, articulate, and eerily detached. He discussed Kathleen's disappearance as though he were describing a weather event. He talked about Susan's death with the emotional range of someone ordering lunch. He revisited the Galveston trial with what seemed like quiet pride. He had beaten the system, and he knew it. But Jarecki's team was not just recording interviews. They were investigating. Behind the scenes, the documentary crew was doing the work that law enforcement had struggled to do for decades. They were digging through records, tracking down witnesses, comparing documents, and building a timeline that would bring all 3 cases into a single frame. And they found something. When Susan Berman was killed in December 2000, the LAPD had received an anonymous note. The note was sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department. It contained Susan Berman's address, 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive, and a single word, cadaver. The handwriting was distinctive, block letters. The Beverly Hills address misspelled as __, quote, _2__. For years, investigators had wondered who sent that note. Who knew Susan Berman was dead before anyone else? Who sent the police to her door? Jarecki's team found a second document, a letter Robert Durst had written to Susan Berman years earlier. The handwriting matched, the block letters matched, and the misspelling matched. Beverly written as Beverly. The same distinctive error, the same hand. Robert Durst had written the cadaver note. He had sent the police to Susan Berman's body. He had alerted authorities to a death that he claimed to know nothing about. When confronted with this evidence during the final interview, Robert Durst was shaken. For the first time in hours of composed, controlled conversation, he stumbled. He could not explain the handwriting. He could not explain the misspelling. He tried to suggest that someone else might have written it, but the comparison was devastating. Side by side, the two documents were practically identical. And then came the moment, the final interview. March of 2015. Robert Durst, sitting across from Andrew Jarecki. The cameras rolling, the microphones live. Jarecki presents the handwriting evidence, the cadaver note side by side with the letter to Susan, the identical block letters, the identical misspelling. Durst looks at the two documents. He blinks. He stammers. For a man who had spent decades projecting calm. This is the first visible crack. He asks for a break. Jarecki agrees. Durst stands up. He is still wearing his lavalier microphone, the small clip-on device attached to his lapel, standard documentary equipment, designed to capture every word the subject says, whether they are sitting in a chair or walking across a room. The microphone does not care about context. It does not know the difference between an interview and a private moment. It simply records. Robert Durst walks to the bathroom. He closes the door. He does not remove the microphone. He does not turn it off. Perhaps he forgot it was there. Perhaps he assumed it was only active during the formal interview. Perhaps, after decades of believing he was untouchable, he simply did not think about it. The bathroom door is closed. The camera cannot see him, but the microphone is live, and the recording captures what happened next. Robert Durst begins talking to himself, muttering. The audio is slightly muffled by the bathroom acoustics, but the words are distinguishable. The sound engineers at HBO cleaned up the audio, enhanced it, isolated the frequencies, and what they heard was this. There it is, you are caught. A pause, water running, then more muttering. Then, clear as a bell, 6 words that would end 4 decades of impunity. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course. He said it to himself, in a bathroom, alone, talking to the mirror, or to the walls, or to the ghost of whatever conscience he had left. And the microphone heard every syllable. What the hell did I do? Killed them all. Of course, not a confession under oath, not a statement to police, not an admission in a courtroom, a whisper, a private moment of reckoning with himself. The kind of thing you say when you think no one is listening. But someone was listening, a tiny piece of technology clipped to his collar. Andrew Jarecki and his team heard the recording. They understood immediately what they had. They also understood the legal and ethical complexity. This was not evidence gathered by law enforcement. This was audio captured during a documentary production. The chain of custody, the admissibility, the constitutional questions, all of that would have to be sorted out by lawyers and judges. Jarecki contacted law enforcement, the FBI, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The recording was shared. The investigation that had been dormant for 15 years, the case of Susan Berman, roared back to life. On March 14, 2015, the night before the final episode of The Jinx was scheduled to air on HBO, FBI agents arrested Robert Durst at a Marriott hotel in New Orleans. He was in possession of a revolver and over $40,000 in cash. He had his passport. He had a latex mask that could alter his appearance. He was not going to that hotel for the continental breakfast. Robert Durst was charged with the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. The case that Los Angeles had been unable to build for 15 years finally had momentum. The cadaver note, the handwriting match, the bathroom confession, the timeline, the motive. But the legal process was anything but swift. From his arrest in March 2015 to the start of his trial, 6 years passed. 6 years of motions, delays, legal maneuvering, and a global pandemic that shut down courtrooms across the country. Robert Durst's defense team used every tool available: competency hearings, health concerns, pandemic delays, jurisdictional arguments. Durst was in his late 70s. He was frail. He was in a wheelchair. His lawyers argued he was too ill to stand trial. But the wheels of justice, however slowly, kept turning. On March 15, 2021, the trial of Robert Durst for the murder of Susan Berman finally began in Los Angeles Superior Court. More than 20 years after Susan was found with a bullet in her head, more than 6 years after the bathroom recording. The trial that the families of 3 victims had waited decades for. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the timeline. Kathleen vanishes in 1982. The Westchester investigation reopens in 2000. Susan Berman, the one person who could corroborate or destroy Robert's alibi, is killed days before her scheduled interview with investigators. The cadaver note, written in Robert's handwriting, sent to police to lead them to Susan's body. The identical misspelling of Beverly as Beverly. The bathroom recording. They called witness after witness. Friends of Kathleen who described the abuse. Friends of Susan who described her fear in the weeks before her death. Investigators who had spent years building the case. Handwriting experts who confirmed the match between the cadaver note and Robert's known writing samples. And they played the tape. In a Los Angeles courtroom, through speakers, the jury heard the voice of Robert Durst in that bathroom. The muttering, the water running, and then the words. "What the hell did I do?" Killed them all, of course. The defense argued that the recording was ambiguous, that Durst was confused, possibly rehearsing what prosecutors might say about him. That talking to yourself in a bathroom is not a confession, that the words were taken out of context. But context was exactly what the prosecution had spent 20 years building. The context was Kathleen. The context was Susan. The context was Morris Black. The context was flight, disguise, dismemberment, and an anonymous note directing police to a dead woman's body. The words in the bathroom were not isolated. They were the capstone of a pattern that stretched across 4 decades. On September 17, 2021, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. Susan Berman. Robert Durst, 78 years old, sitting in a wheelchair, wearing a brown suit that hung loose on his skeletal frame, heard the word guilty and showed almost no reaction. His eyes, which had been described by journalists for decades as dead, as empty, as belonging to something other than a fully human being, did not change. He blinked. He looked at his lawyers. He said nothing. On October 14, 2021, Robert Durst was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, Mark Wyndham, noted that the evidence showed Durst had killed Susan Berman to prevent her from cooperating with investigators looking into the disappearance of Kathleen McCormack Durst. One murder to cover another, a chain of death that stretched across 2 decades, linked by one man's determination to never be held accountable. But the story does not end with the sentencing. Because Robert Durst's body, which his lawyers had argued was too frail for trial, was now failing in earnest. He had been battling multiple health conditions throughout the trial. Bladder cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He was on a ventilator at times. He was fed through a tube. The man who had once been the heir to billions of dollars in Manhattan real estate was disintegrating in a California prison hospital. On January 10, 2022, less than 4 months after his sentencing, Robert Durst died at the age of 78 at the California healthcare facility in Stockton. Cause of death: cardiac arrest, complicated by the multiple conditions that had been ravaging his body. He died in a prison hospital bed, not in a penthouse, not in a mansion, not in any of the luxury apartments or country homes that his family's fortune could have provided. He died as inmate number AX4721 in a facility designed for prisoners too sick to survive in general population. And with his death, any remaining chance of criminal accountability for the disappearance of Kathleen McCormack Durst died with him. The Westchester County District Attorney's Office had been preparing to bring charges related to Kathleen. They were building a case. But you cannot prosecute a dead man. Kathleen McCormack Durst was declared legally dead in 2017, 35 years after her disappearance. Her body has never been found. Her family has never had a funeral. There is no grave to visit. There is no closure in the way that word is normally understood. The family of Susan Berman saw a conviction. That is something. After 21 years, someone was held legally responsible for her death. But Susan is still gone. Her voice, her stories, her talent as a writer, all of it erased by a single bullet on Christmas Eve. Morris Black. The man whose dismembered body was pulled from Galveston Bay. The man whose murder Robert Durst was acquitted of. The man whose head was never found. Morris Black has no family that came forward, no one who stood up in court to speak for him. He was alone in life, and he remains alone in death. An acquittal that still stands, a verdict that can never be retried. 3 people, 3 decades, one man at the center of all of it. Robert Durst was born into a family that owned pieces of the New York City skyline. He had access to the best education, the best lawyers, the best version of everything that money can buy. And he used all of it, every dollar, every connection, every advantage, to stay one step ahead of the consequences of what he did. For 40 years, it worked. The system bent around him. Police investigations stalled, witnesses died, juries acquitted. The machinery of justice, which is supposed to treat every person equally, treated Robert Durst the way it treats anyone with unlimited resources. It gave him time. It gave him space. It gave him the benefit of every doubt. And in the end, it was not a detective who caught him. It was not a prosecutor. It was not a breakthrough in forensic science or a witness who finally came forward. It was a microphone. A tiny clip-on lavalier microphone that cost less than $100. Attached to his lapel by a sound technician who was just doing a job. Left on by accident or oversight. Recording to a digital file that sat on a hard drive until an editor found it. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course. 5 words in an empty bathroom. That is what brought down an empire of silence. Not a confession beaten out of a suspect in an interrogation room. Not a dramatic courtroom revelation. A man alone with himself, in a moment he believed was private, speaking the truth that he had spent his entire life denying. There is something almost poetic about it. Almost. If you can find poetry in 4 decades of murder and evasion, the man who controlled every narrative, who managed every interview, who hired the best lawyers to shape every legal proceeding, could not control the one conversation that mattered, the conversation with himself. Killed them all, of course. Of course. That word, of course, as if it were obvious, as if the question were rhetorical, as if the answer had always been sitting there, waiting for someone to hear it. And now you have heard it. This has been Miles' Ghost Hunter, Episode 8. And next time, Episode 9, a different kind of monster. Not a billionaire, not a celebrity, just a neighbor. The kind of person you pass in the hallway without a second glance. The kind of person who mows the lawn on Saturday and waves at the mailman. The kind of person who has a crawl space. Subscribe if your nerves can handle it.